Two cops thought they could intimidate a young black woman alone in the park until she handed them her phone and said, "The mayor wants to speak to you." What followed wasn't just shocking, it was historic. This isn't just about abuse of power. It's about what happens when the system targets the wrong woman. Watch until the end, because this story will leave you breathless. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story, it is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. Prospect Park on a Sunday afternoon was a sanctuary of light laughter and lazy breeze. In the shaded arc of a winding footpath, the air smelled like wildflowers and sunscreen. Children squealed on scooters, dogs chased frisbees across the grass, and lovers strolled in comfortable silence. It was the kind of afternoon where nothing bad should ever happen. Which is why the scream hit so hard. Seconds before that scream, Zaria Blake sat on a bench, tucked under a canopy of sycamore trees. A worn paperback rested in her lap, her fingers gently drumming against the pages as she lost herself in a passage about resilience of all things. She was alone, but not lonely. Her light blue maxi dress, flowing linen modest but elegant, caught the wind every now and then, fluttering like a flag of peace. Her sandals were dusty from the path, her curls were piled into a high bun, and her face was calm, reflective, and utterly unsuspecting. She didn't see them coming. "Hey, girl," a voice rang out, coarse and inappropriate. "That's a nice dress. Mind giving us a peek underneath?" Zaria blinked, frowning, unsure if she'd heard correctly. She looked up. Two uniformed NYPD officers stood a few paces away, their presence jarring against the park's serenity. One of them, stocky and red-faced, wore a grin that soured the air. His badge read, "McCullers." The other, younger and thinner, trailed behind his eyes, uncertain. Nolan. They weren't smiling the way cops smile when they're just passing through. They were leering. Zaria closed her book slowly. She didn't stand yet. "Excuse me," she asked, voice even controlled. McCullers stepped closer, baton dangling from his right hand like a toy. "Relax," he said. "Just doing a little community check. You fit the profile of someone we're looking for." "Profile?" Zaria asked. "I'm reading a book." "Yeah," he said, the smirk sharpening. "But you're sitting where people shouldn't be loitering." "There's no sign," she replied calmly. "Don't get smart," McCullers snapped. And then, in a blur of movement so fast and surreal, it seemed imaginary, McCullers took the baton, hooked the bottom hem of her dress, and flipped it upward in a crude arc, high enough to reveal her thighs and the delicate lace of her undergarments beneath. Zaria gasped, body instinctively, recoiling hands yanking her dress down in horror. The other officer, Nolan, let out a startled laugh. Not the sound of cruelty, but the laugh of a man who's unsure of the rules and too cowardly to challenge them. It was over in less than 3 seconds. But those seconds stretched like wire. People nearby froze, confused. One woman turned away. A jogger slowed, unsure what he was seeing. The world seemed to tip sideways. Zaria shot to her feet. "You think this is funny?" she said, voice trembling. "You think this is acceptable?" McCullers shrugged. "Calm down. It was just a joke." "A joke," she repeated, her voice ablade now. "That was sexual assault. That was a violation. Nolan looked down at his feet. McCullers' smirk flickered. You really want to start something, sweetheart, he said. Zaria didn't flinch. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. No, I want to finish it. She dialed. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. From fury. The phone rang once, twice, then, Zaria, what's going on? The voice on the other end was calm, deep, and unmistakably powerful. Dad, she said, her voice cracking. Now I need you. Prospect Park. 2 officers. They just lifted my dress. With a baton. I'm not okay. A beat of silence. Then put one of them on the phone. Right now. Zaria held the phone out toward McCullers. It's the mayor, my father. He wants to speak to you. The world stopped. McCullers stared at the phone like it was a grenade. Nolan's face had gone white. The handful of people watching suddenly understood the context. And in that collective realization, a wave of outrage rippled through the air. Zaria stood unmoving, her chin lifted. McCullers snatched the phone with a huff. Who is this? He barked. Whatever was said on the other end, McCullers' face transformed. His bravado collapsed. He stiffened like a man hearing his own death sentence. Yes, sir, he said. No, sir. I didn't know. Yes. He handed the phone back without a word. Then he took a step back. Then another. I didn't know you were, he began. You didn't need to, Zaria cut in. I shouldn't have to be someone for you to treat me like someone. Nolan, trembling now, whispered, I didn't mean. But you watched, she said. You said nothing. Police sirens howled in the distance. Reinforcements. Not for her. For them. Internal Affairs was on its way. Someone had already filmed the incident. It was already online. In 30 seconds, hashtags would appear. In an hour, the city would know. But right now, it was just her. Zaria sat back down, her dress smoothed her book beside her. She looked at the officers, both now visibly panicked. I hope you enjoyed the view, she said coldly, because your careers just ended at the hemline of my dignity. And somewhere inside Prospect Park, a little girl clutched her mother's hand watching. The mother whispered something in her ear. That woman's not just brave, she said. She's the line they just crossed. And from here on out, everything would change. It wasn't long before the patrol cars began to arrive. Sirens had been cut before they turned the corner into the east side of Prospect Park. But the urgency remained. Within minutes, the quiet trail where Zaria Blake stood became the site of a silent reckoning. 3 more officers stepped out, led by a lieutenant, whose face changed the moment he saw Zaria, not because of who she was, but because of what had clearly just happened. McCullers and Nolan stood stiff, the color gone from their faces, their voices clipped and evasive when questioned. Zaria didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply replayed the call and then calmly offered the name Mayor Ellis Blake, her father. There was a brief silence, sharp and complete. One of the junior officers whispered under his breath, No way. Another, older and more aware, closed his eyes like he'd just seen the end of something. Zaria didn't wait to be asked questions. She pulled out her phone again, this time showing the video a bystander had sent her. It was shaky, but damning McCullers, raising the baton, the skirt lifting, the moment frozen in digital permanence. The lieutenant turned pale. Ma'am, we're so sorry. Please allow me to escort you to safety. But Zaria stood still. I don't need an escort. I need accountability. Don't clean this up. Don't soften it. You all saw what happened. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was targeted, deliberate, and criminal. By nightfall, the footage had gone viral. The headline on one local news blog read, "NYC officer assaults black woman in park, victim is the mayor's daughter." The story moved fast. Within an hour, more reputable outlets had picked it up. And by morning, every newsroom across the country had it queued. But it wasn't just the video that shocked people. It was the name. Zaria Blake wasn't just anyone. She was a Harvard Law graduate, a youth rights advocate, a co-founder of the Liberty Forward Initiative, and a frequent speaker on policing reform in urban communities. She had written op-eds, mentored students, and sat on panels alongside civil rights legends. Her father, Mayor Ellis Blake, had made sweeping strides in reshaping New York's public safety framework. His daughter had helped draft key parts of that policy. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The police officers who had profiled and assaulted her had walked directly into the storm they'd sworn to avoid. The next morning, Mayor Blake didn't hold a press conference. He didn't need to. The footage spoke louder than any podium, but he did make one appearance unannounced at the City Council emergency meeting called at 8 a.m. sharp. He entered the chamber quietly, his presence reverberating like thunder. "I'm not here today as your mayor," he said, taking the mic. "I'm here as a father who raised his daughter to believe that this city, this department could do better. And yesterday, 2 officers in this very city proved that we still have work to do." His words were not shouted, but they landed like stone. I want to be clear. This isn't about Zaria being my daughter. This is about Zaria being a human being. Because if this could happen to someone like her, with status, with education, with every societal advantage, then what do you think is happening to the girls who don't have that protection? The ones whose names don't trend? The room fell silent. Across the city, conversations erupted. In classrooms, kids asked if it was true. In churches, community halls, and bodegas, the story was shared again and again. But it wasn't just anger that filled the city. It was shame, not just for what had happened, but for how unsurprising it had become. At the police precinct, internal affairs descended fast. McCullers was suspended immediately without pay, pending investigation. Nolan was placed on leave, and a wave of sudden clarity swept through the department. This wasn't a PR crisis. This was an institutional quake. Inside her apartment, Zaria sat with her mother, Evelyn, a retired journalist who gently placed a cup of tea in her daughter's hands. "You always said the fight would find you when you weren't looking," she said quietly. Zaria nodded. It didn't knock. It broke in. But even as the city raged and sympathized, Zaria felt something deeper: exhaustion. She'd spent years studying systems, working within them, believing in change. But no theory could prepare her. For the moment, a man with a badge looked at her like a target and treated her like one. She hadn't just been humiliated. She had been dehumanized. Still, there was one thing she refused to feel: silence. That evening, without fanfare, she posted a statement. No press team, no legal filter, just her words, raw and precise. "I was assaulted by officers sworn to protect this city. Not because I broke the law, but because I dared to exist quietly, confidently, and unapologetically. My name should not have mattered. But now that it does, let's use it. Not to elevate me, but to uncover how many more like me there are." This isn't a moment for pity. It's a call for policy. The statement trended for 3 days straight. By the end of the week, A petition demanding structural change and officer accountability had reached 500,000 signatures. Civil rights organizations from coast to coast joined hands. But more than that, everyday people began to speak. They told their own stories of profiling, of fear of being reduced to skin and silence. Zaria read each one, because her name had become a symbol, but her voice, steady and unshaken, was about to become a movement. And the two officers, who once thought they could lift a dress without consequence, they were now standing in the center of a national reckoning, facing the full weight of a name they should have known: Zaria Blake. A name that would echo far beyond Prospect Park. The pressure was no longer confined to private calls or quiet acknowledgments. The whole city watched, waiting not just for statements, but for action. Zaria Blake had lit a match, but it was the people fed up with years of unresolved complaints, systemic silence, and performative reforms who turned it into a blaze. Now the question wasn't if justice would be served. It was what justice would look like and whether it would come swiftly enough to matter. The NYPD's response had started as damage control. They promised an immediate internal review and full cooperation with the mayor's office. But in the age of digital accountability, words meant little. Every social media platform overflowed with the hashtag Justice for Zaria, and under it thousands of personal stories poured in like floodwaters. People recounted humiliations, false stops, quiet terrors in the back of patrol cars. Zaria's case was no longer an isolated incident. It was a mirror reflecting an institutional sickness. Zaria, meanwhile, refused to be sidelined by the attention. While the mayor's office handled legal proceedings and oversight coordination, she returned to the very essence of her work community. She held a public forum at the Langston Hughes Community Center, not for cameras, but for voices that rarely had room to speak. More than 200 people packed the room, sitting shoulder to shoulder, many standing against walls. Some were in suits, others wore hoodies. All came with something heavy to release. A high school teacher stood up, recounting how a student of hers, a 15-year-old boy, was once forced to the ground because he fit a description. A single mother described how officers accused her of check fraud because she dared to walk into a bank in East Harlem in a silk blouse and natural hair. A middle-aged Latino man, trembling as he spoke, simply said, "They don't see me. I'm either invisible or dangerous." Zaria listened, eyes sharp, jaw clenched not in anger, but in concentration. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't begin with condemnation. She began with confession. "I was raised to believe justice came from process," she said. "But that day in the park, I learned that justice has to be personal before it can ever be systemic. You cannot reform what you refuse to name." The room silent at first erupted into applause, not the kind fueled by spectacle, but the kind that recognizes truth when it's spoken. At City Hall, Mayor Ellis Blake was building pressure of his own. Alongside the City Council, he pushed for an unprecedented move, a public disciplinary tribunal, live-stream transparent, and without departmental interference. It would be the first time in city history that an incident of police misconduct involving a public figure would be reviewed in real time under the public eye. Civil liberties groups had long called for such proceedings. Now they had a case impossible to ignore. The day of the tribunal, cameras were allowed to roll. Inside a packed auditorium, officers McCullers and Nolan sat at the front, flanked by attorneys. Behind them, members of the Civilian Complaint Review Board, and just a few rows back, Zaria sat quietly, not as a plaintiff, but as a citizen. Testimonies were heard. Body camera footage was played. It showed everything: the leering comment, the unwanted approach, the baton, the skirt, and finally, the laughter. Then came the testimony of Zaria herself. She stood behind the microphone, steady, unsparing. "I was not seen as a person that day," she said. "I was seen as an object to inspect, a curiosity to humiliate. And had I not been the mayor's daughter, I would have just been another incident lost in a backlogged file." The weight of her words filled the air like smoke. When the tribunal concluded, the board convened briefly and then delivered its recommendation: immediate termination for both officers with referral to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation on grounds of sexual assault and abuse of authority. The room held its breath. Then it exhaled. Justice in real time had not only spoken, it had moved. Outside, a crowd had gathered, not in protest, but in solidarity. Signs read, "No more quiet victims," and "Power protection from accountability." Zaria exited the building without a speech, but someone handed her a child's drawing, scribbled crayon figures of a black woman standing tall with the words, "You make me brave." And in that moment she smiled. Justice did not end at verdicts. It began in those quiet, tender moments when dignity was restored, not by law, but by belief. Later that night, Zaria sat on her balcony, looking out over Brooklyn's skyline. Her phone buzzed, but she ignored it. She'd spent the day answering questions, emails, media requests. Now she needed silence, not because she was weary, but because she was planning, because the fight wasn't finished. The laws weren't rewritten. The training manuals hadn't been touched, but a window had opened, and she intended to walk through it and hold the door for everyone else still waiting to be seen. Justice, she realized, wasn't about perfection. It was about motion. And finally, it was moving in the right direction. Zaria Blake never believed change came from power alone. She had seen too many powerful people remain silent. Too many powerful systems protect themselves first. Real change, she always said, doesn't wear a badge or carry a podium. Sometimes it wears a dress torn by shame, mended by courage, and pressed into armor by conviction. In the weeks following the tribunal, the shock of what had happened still lingered across New York City. But what lingered more powerfully was Zaria's quiet refusal to be reduced to a footnote. Her presence in city life, no longer just the daughter of a mayor or the executive of a nonprofit, had become something else entirely. She had become a walking answer to a question no one wanted to ask. What does systemic accountability actually look like? Mayor Ellis Blake wasted no time translating that answer into motion. With Zaria's support, he proposed the Civilian Dignity and Oversight Act, a sweeping bill that redefined officer training, established a citywide civilian review council with budgetary power, and required bias intervention coursework for all public-facing departments. It was the first legislation of its kind, drafted with input from victims of misconduct, community organizers, psychologists, and even former officers who had left the force in protest of the status quo. The law passed with thunderous support, not just because of Zaria, but because people could no longer pretend they hadn't seen. Not after the footage, not after the tribunal, not after that speech in which Zaria stood beneath the seal of New York and said, "You cannot change what you refuse to name." But her work didn't stop with policy. Zaria turned Empower Forward, her nonprofit, into something larger. It became a civic hub, rebranded as the Blake Center for Public Integrity. The mission to support citizens who had suffered from institutional harm, to train city workers in cultural competency, and to serve as a think tank for justice systems across the country. Her first hire was a young black woman named Keisha, an NYU law graduate, who years earlier had once written Zaria an email saying, "I want to be you when I grow up." Now she was helping draft national reform models alongside her. The center offered restorative justice circles, allowing those impacted by misconduct to speak directly with leaders from law enforcement in guided therapeutic spaces. These weren't publicity stunts. They were raw, sometimes painful, but often transformative conversations that began to rebuild trust brick by brick. Zaria also launched the Dignity Internship Fund, which placed high school students from underserved neighborhoods inside city agencies, legal offices, and ethics committees, not to sanitize the system, but to understand it and reshape it from within. She believed future reform didn't begin in courtrooms. It began in classrooms. One of those interns, a 17-year-old named Devin, once asked her during a Q&A session, "How did you know you'd survive that day in the park?" Zaria paused, then answered honestly, "I didn't, but I knew I wouldn't surrender." And sometimes surviving is just that, refusing to disappear when someone tries to erase you. Outside her office, a mural went up, not commissioned by the city, but painted by a local artist who had watched her story unfold from the sidelines. It depicted a silhouette of a woman walking forward, her shadow made of broken police tape and protest signs her face held high. Across the wall in big painted strokes were Zaria's words. "They tried to shame me in a dress. I wore it into battle." For Zaria, that dress, the one torn by violation and stitched with resistance, became a symbol. Not of trauma, but of reclamation. She donated it to the Museum of Civil Rights downtown, where it sat inside a glass case next to the notebook of a civil rights lawyer and a bullhorn from a march in 1968. The plaque read, "What she wore doesn't explain what happened. What she did after does." Because systemic change doesn't always start in courtrooms. Sometimes it begins in a public park on an ordinary Sunday, with a girl in a dress, and the courage not to stay silent. The first time Zaria Blake walked past the patrol car stationed outside City Hall, after everything, she didn't flinch. She didn't avert her gaze. She didn't stiffen her shoulders in anticipation of being stopped. She simply kept walking chin-level heart, steady, her silence carrying more power than the sound of sirens ever could. That was the quiet evolution of her life, not in grand declarations, but in the refusal to shrink again. She had become many things in the months that followed the incident: a symbol, a strategist, a reformer. But through it all, she remained something far more rare: unbent. The trauma of what had been done to her hadn't broken her, but neither had it been erased. It lived in her bones, yes, but not as fear. It lived there as purpose. For many in the city, Zaria's story marked a before and after. The before was a world where misconduct could be silenced, buried under bureaucracy, and whispers of "not all cops." The after was something different. It was public, documented, named. It was a line that could no longer be uncrossed. And still she chose presence over retreat. She continued to show up, not for applause, but for accountability. At town halls, she sat in the back rows beside elders and high schoolers alike. She asked hard questions without demanding attention. She attended officer graduation ceremonies, not as a guest of honor, but as a reminder. She wanted new cadets to understand that protecting dignity wasn't a performance, it was a discipline. The media moved on. The headlines faded, but Zaria remained, not as a trending name, but as a living threshold. And people remembered. There was a moment weeks later when a girl barely in her teens approached her on the subway platform. She looked nervous, clutching a tattered backpack and wearing a hoodie far too big for her. "Are you the woman from the park?" she asked in a whisper. Zaria nodded. The girl didn't say anything else, just leaned forward and hugged her. That moment didn't make the news, but Zaria carried it with her, heavier and more sacred than any award she would later receive. Because what mattered most wasn't the viral videos or the legislation. It was what people did in the quiet afterward, when no one was filming, when standing up was still hard. Zaria never let herself forget that power, real lasting power, was measured by how it treated the most overlooked among us. She mentored a group of young girls from neighborhoods often policed more than protected. She taught them how to recognize their rights, how to organize, and most importantly, how to remain grounded in who they were. Dignity, she told them, isn't something someone else gives you. It's something you carry even when the world tries to knock it out of your hands. Those girls would later become organizers, lawyers, public servants, and every single one of them could trace their fire back to that park bench, to that voice that refused to tremble. Officer Kyle McCullers and Officer Nolan, the two who had once laughed in her face and violated her body, had disappeared from the public record. Their names only resurfaced in disciplinary reports and mandatory ethics seminars. Their removal hadn't fixed the system, but it had sent a message: impunity was no longer guaranteed. Zaria didn't rejoice in their fall. That wasn't her nature. But she did believe in reckoning, and in the hard, relentless work that follows it. She knew her name had become shorthand for a movement used in classrooms, community training guides, and even a new university course titled Civil Courage in Contemporary America. But she also knew her story wasn't unique. It was one in a long line of names who had dared to resist erasure. The difference was, this time, the world couldn't look away. As she stood one night on the balcony of her modest apartment looking over the city skyline, she thought about legacy, not the kind that's etched in marble, but the kind that lingers in behavior, in policy, in the decision someone makes tomorrow because they saw her stand up yesterday. Dignity had a strange power. It didn't scream. It didn't rage. But when protected, it became unshakable. Zaria Blake had worn her dignity like a shield. And when they tried to tear it away, she didn't bow. She rose. And the city, at last, rose with her. Zaria Blake's story didn't begin with power. It began with peace, with a book in her hand and sunlight filtering through trees in a quiet park. What happened that afternoon wasn't just an assault on her body. It was an assault on the idea that Black women could exist in public without explanation, without permission, without scrutiny. But what followed was not the story of a woman broken by injustice. It became the story of a woman who turned humiliation into resolve and silence into strength. The two officers who demeaned her thought they were untouchable. They believed their uniforms gave them immunity, that their behavior would be written off as a joke forgotten by nightfall. What they didn't expect was that the young woman they tried to strip of dignity was the daughter of the city's highest elected official, and far more importantly, a leader in her own right. Zaria didn't respond with rage. She responded with clarity. She chose truth. And in doing so, she exposed a culture of entitlement that had long gone unchecked. Her courage set off a chain reaction. The truth was undeniable. Eyewitnesses stepped forward. The mayor acted swiftly. The police chief launched a transparent investigation. The officers were not just fired, they were publicly held accountable, their misconduct documented, and their shame unmistakable. But even more powerful was what Zaria chose to do afterward. She could have retreated. Instead, she led. She mentored. She spoke not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been told, "Be quiet. Don't make trouble." She helped build a blueprint for how a city could begin again through accountability education and community healing. So what's the lesson we take from Zaria's journey? It's this power can be misused, but it can also be reclaimed. Dignity isn't something fragile, it's something forged. And justice doesn't only live in courtrooms, it lives in our daily choices, in whether we speak up, whether we listen, whether we demand more from the systems meant to protect us. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or disrespected, know this: your voice matters. Your presence matters. And your story, like Zaria's, could be the one that wakes a city up. If this story moved you, if you believe these narratives must continue to be told, subscribe to our channel. Help us bring more untold truths to light. Your support fuels this work. Together we can shine a light on injustice and inspire the kind of change that doesn't just make headlines, but makes history.